welcome to my channel. This is Margaret Lewin and you are at Margaret Lewin Quilting. Today I wanted to go over some questions that everybody had in regards to the Moda Sampler Block Shuffle. This is my first quilt. I am working away at the second quilt. It's not quite done. Hopefully it'll be done by Friday. But in the meantime, I wanted to answer some of your questions so that you guys can all get working on your quilts. So the first questions were, they wanted me to show them exactly how I square up my blocks. Well, I'm going to show you how I do it. I'm going to go about showing you how to square up a quilt block. All of the blocks really do need to get squared up in the quilt. And how I do it is I take a ruler that's really pretty close to the size of the finished block. Our blocks are 6.5 inch unfinished, 6 inch finished. And this is my 9.5 inch Creative Grits ruler. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and I'm looking at a couple of different points to line it up. One of them is on this ruler, there's a really nice 1/4 inch mark here, and there's a really nice 1/4 inch mark over here. Then the other thing that I'm looking for is you can see that there's a horizontal line here across and some vertical lines going up and down. So what I do is I want this block to 6.5 inches. So I'm going to start up here and here, just looking with my eye where it is, trying to get it measured out. Then the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my vertical lines, and I'm pretty good vertically, and then I'm going to look at my horizontal lines. And quite honestly, on my horizontal lines, I'm a little bit off. Not a lot, but just a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of mess with it. Just kind of back and forth a little bit so I can make sure that I've got it straight. And these are the points that I'm looking at. I'm looking at this line and this line. I'm looking at these two lines especially, the vertical lines. And then I'm looking across here at the bottom. So what I'm going to do on my first round is I'm just going to trim this up now that I've got it pretty good. And then I just actually take my fingernail and slide it across there. Then I can clean it up easily. Then I'm going to rotate my block and I'm going to do that again. So my first lineup is I'm looking over here for my 6.5, and my block is a little bit bigger than 6.5. But I'm looking at my 1/4 here and my 1/4 there. My 1/4 there, there's not quite that exact 1/4. And and then I'm looking for my lines going up and down, my vertical lines, and I'm going to trim this up again. All right, now let's clean this up, all these nice little threads. This always makes a mess. And I'm going to put my ruler back on it again and see where I'm at all over. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of my blocks. The next thing that I wanted to go over with you, and I can just talk to you about that, is if your blocks are not quite the exact size that the pattern calls for, that's okay. Let's say your blocks are 6 3/4 instead of the 6.5 unfinished. That's not an issue, as long as they're all consistent, okay? That's the biggest thing. So let's say that all of your blocks finished at 6 3/4 instead of the 6.5. That's not a problem. What you're going to do is, instead of cutting your setting blocks at 6.5, cut them at 6 3/4 so that they all fit. What you're really looking for is consistency. That's really what's most important. Another question that I had was in regards to the flying geese and how to go about measuring them. I was asked how I got the measurement for my flying geese and how I calculated it out. Once the quilt was all done, I measured from this corner over to that corner horizontally. I measured the center and then I measured the bottom. I added those three numbers together and divided them by 3. what I came up with was the average of the width of the quilt. Once I had that average, I took my flying geese and I just calculated out for a round number to begin with exactly how many geese finished at 1.5 inches would fit within that amount of space. So then I just put my flying geese together. Once I had them all together, then I did my real final measurement so that I knew that what I was putting across the top and across the bottom border together would actually fit in there. What happened, I wrote down some little notes here. I ended up with 27 flying geese across the bottom and across the top. The 27 times 1.5 ended up being about 40.5 inches. When I added the 1/2 inch quarter on both sides, that was gonna be the allotment for the seam, I was at 41 inches. So I worked out really good, really easy. There wasn't a problem with it. But now your next question is gonna be, what happens if you're off like a full 2 inches and you've got a major issue? There's nothing that doesn't say that I couldn't have taken the extra space and put a 4-patch here. Or I could have done one solid block that would have set it off. Or I could have done a 1/4 square block. There's a bunch of different blocks that you could have done in those corners to compensate for any additional fabric that you needed to make up for. So that's how I handled that. The last question was to explain what I meant by these triangles were cut so that the bias was inside on the triangle. So we're also going to explain that. The next question that I was asked had to do with the corner triangles and the fact that they had us cutting them so that the bias was inside and on the outside of the quilt was the straight of grain. Well, what this does is this doesn't allow the quilt to stretch. So I'm going to show you. If we had cut these blocks so that let's see which is the easiest way to show you. The way they had us cut these blocks, the straight of grain was the outside. The triangle, and I'll cut you one, hang on. Let's cut you a triangle. Let's cut one here, that makes it easier. So here, I'm gonna cut a triangle. And this, my grandchildren are messing me up here. All right, when you cut a triangle, you've got 3 sides to it. One of the sides is the straight of grain. See, it doesn't really move much. These other 2 sides are the bias. And see how much that gives? It's the cross grain of the fabric. This side is also the bias. See how much it gives? Well, the way the instructions had us cut these triangles were, we cut them just like this. We did one, then we did the next, and then we did the next. What that did is that created the straight of the grain on the longest part of the triangle. And also, so what happens is this straight of the grain is on the outside. So there isn't the give on the outside of the quilt. And the bias is sewn down, it's on the inside, and it's connecting to the next block. Now, let's pretend that let's just make a square. And I'm gonna show you, this is the way that many times they have you cutting squares. In fact, we cut squares or triangles this way many times in the video. So we've got a 3-inch square. We'll go a little bit more than 3. What they had us do many times were to cut a square. Now look, here I've got my straight of grain, here I've got my straight, straight, and straight. But look what I've got here. I've got my bias. See my fabrics moving? Well, if I'm gonna now take this and cut it into a half square triangle, I'm gonna cut it. I've got a half square triangle. Now my bias is out here. So I'm going to take you over to the quilt and show you what that means. Further explain, what's happened on this is this part of the triangle is where my bias is. So this is where my greatest amount of stretch is. Because I have sewn it and attached it down to these blocks, it really is contained. It's not going to do a lot of stretching. And my straight of grain is out here. So what's happened is this is now contained. If for some reason, let's say we had cut this in a square and our bias was out here, what you run the risk of is stretching this portion of the fabric. So what would end up happening is, let's say that you were adding the border to it and you hadn't measured it really well. Well, what could happen is you could stretch this. So now when you go to quilt it, you're going to end up with wavy borders because there's excess fabric here. It got stretched and it's not contained any other place. So that's a really good reason for doing the straight of grain on the outside and containing the bias to the inside of the quilt. Just kind of helps you with it not stretching quite so much. So there's that answer. I'd like to thank you for joining me. This is the first quilt done for the Moda Sampler Block Shuffle. I am working away at the second one and hopefully I'll have that video up on next Friday. If you have any questions in regard to that as you're working on your quilt, please don't hesitate to contact me. Because lots of times it helps me to understand where I can help you in quilting. So I hope I answered all of your questions and thank you so very much for joining me. Have a great day and I'll see you again next week. Bye.